friends, if you would like to create an ACOTAR inspired Dawn Court postage stamp embroidery just like this, then keep on watching. The first step is to print off the pattern. The pattern also comes along with written instructions on how to complete this project. I'll have it linked in the description below. Once you've printed off the pattern, it's time to assemble your hoop and your fabric. Place your fabric within the hoop and then pull on the edges to make sure the fabric is taut. You want to make sure there are no weird tension areas. It should just be a flat surface of fabric. The next step is to trace the pattern onto the fabric. I like to keep the fabric in the hoop for this step because it stays nice and taut. I also like to use my iPad for this step. Some people have these really cool things called light boxes, which basically just shine a light upwards and allow you to place a pattern onto the box. And they basically just illuminate the pattern, making it really easy for you to see the darker lines, which then makes it easier for you to trace onto your fabric. I use a specific kind of pencil for this because they need to be very, very sharp and fine lined. I have these specific pencils linked in the shopping list on the downloadable PDF instructions. This step is really important. You want to make sure that you get every single line, every single indent, because this is going to be our guide when we're stitching later. Try to keep pressure on your hoop when you're doing this just to make sure it doesn't slide around on the paper. I don't have any experience with the hoop and the fabric sliding around on the paper. It usually sits in one place very nicely. Don't be afraid to rotate your hoop and your design. Just make sure that the paper comes with you and it doesn't move from its spot. You want to make sure that you're getting really, really clean lines when you're tracing. This is because we're not using an erasable pen or a embroidery specific marker. We're just using regular pencils. So these lines aren't going to be erased afterwards. They're just going to be covered by the embroidery. So that's why we have to use a very, very sharp fine point pencil, and we have to be very, very specific with the marks that we're making. This is what you should be left with when you're done with your tracing. And now we're going to go in with some watercolor pencils to do the shading of the landscape. I have these specific watercolor pencils linked in the PDF. In order to use these watercolor pencils, you will need to slightly dampen your fabric. Notice I say slightly. We do not want this fabric to be super wet. The watercolor pigment will run and it will go just all over the fabric in spots where you don't want it to go if you get the fabric too wet with this spray. So for the Dawn Court, I wanted to go with a sunrise kind of sky, like a purple and a pinky kind of vibe. So for the top of the sky, I'm going in with a purple, and I'm going to take this all the way down almost to where the top of the sun's rays are. And then once I'm happy with how that has turned out, once I'm happy with the pigment on all of the spots, I'm going to go in with a pink color, and then I'm going to just take that pink all the way up into the purple and kind of blend them a bit. Remember, the fabric is a little bit moist, so these two pigments will blend really nicely together if you just color over the other color a little bit with the pink. The most important thing when using this watercolor is to be very, very neat on the outlines. That's going to give you a really crisp, tidy end product. I wanted the top of the sky to be a little bit darker, so I'm going back in with that purple color. A good way to make sure that the watercolor doesn't seep anywhere that you don't want it to is to blot the fabric with some scrap paper or paper towel once you're done with a certain area. If it's feeling a little bit too moist or you're just worried about it seeping over the borders, then just pat some paper or some paper towel on top of that area that you worked on, and it should soak up some of the excess moisture. I'm also going to recommend using a piece of scrap paper or some paper towel to cover areas that you've already worked on, that you've finished, that you've sprayed with water once you are moving to work on new areas. I'm using quite a dark grey for the mountain, but don't worry, it's going to dry a little bit lighter and it's actually going to look great. The watercolor pencils will dry a lot lighter than what they initially appear once you are coloring. Again, be really careful with the borders. You do not want to color outside of the lines by mistake because you will just have to start all over again. Go back in and blot any of the moist areas again with a piece of scrap paper or some paper towel. This is going to make sure that it doesn't seep over the borders by mistake. Then I'm just going to go back in with my pencil and go over some of the terrain lines on the mountain, just to make sure I can still see them behind the pigment of the mountain. And now it is time to get stitching. I have all the thread counts, the thread colors, and the names of the stitches listed in the downloadable PDF, but I'll be giving a brief overview of everything that I'm doing here in this video as well. So to stitch the postage stamp border, we're going to be using a wide mouth lazy daisy stitch for the curved indents, and then just some straight stitches to connect all of the indents. So for the wide mouth lazy daisy stitch, you just need to insert your needle at the edge of one of the indents, and then bring it back down through the fabric on the other side of the indent, and then leave a little bit of loose thread. Pull your needle back up through the fabric at the peak of the indent and thread it through the thread that you left loose, and then pull that tight, and then it should create a curved indent shape. And then you're going to make some small anchor stitches to perfect the curve of this indent. So once you finish the outer border of the stamp, it's time to move on to the inner border of the stamp, which is just the straight lines that border the image. I like to use long straight stitches for each of these lines, and then I anchor them a couple of times. So yeah, just do one long straight stitch and then anchor it 4 to 5 times along the line. Now moving on to the text in the top right corner of the postage stamp. I'm going to be using a combination of stitches for this, but mainly just a straight stitch and then some couch stitches for the curved areas in the letters. Again, this is explained in detail in the downloadable PDF. Once you're done with the text, we're going to move on to the mountains. Now, the mountains have outline stitches, and then they also have terrain stitches, kind of showing like the shadows within the mountain and the way that the terrain moves. For the outline stitches, we're going to be using couch stitches, and then for the terrain stitches, we're going to be using straight stitches. Once you're done with the mountain and all of the terrain stitches, we're going to stitch the sun. For the sun, we're just using a basic satin stitch and then some straight stitches for the rays of the sun. I like to layer these stitches a little bit, the satin stitches, just to give the sun a little bit of a 3D effect. Once you're happy with the sun, we are going to move on to the last stitches for this product, which are going to be French knot stitches for the clouds. So when I stitch the clouds, I like to use 4 strands of embroidery thread, but the technique I like to use is cutting a slightly longer piece of thread that's only 2 strands of density. I thread that through the needle, and then I kind of double the thread up and I knot it at the bottom, so it makes 4 strands of embroidery thread, but it travels through the fabric easier, and I think it makes French knots a lot tidier and easier to stitch. I add a bunch of French knots into these clouds just to make them look really fluffy and 3D, and I make sure that I go right up to the borders of the clouds just to make sure that I go over the pencil that I used to outline the shape earlier. Once you're done with the embroidery, take your scissors and trim the excess fabric around the hoop. Leave about 1 inch of fabric because we're going to glue this to the inside of the embroidery hoop. Now we just need to take a glue gun and press the excess fabric that we have left onto the embroidery hoop and keep going all around the circle until you have the embroidery hoop finished. This is what you should be left with when you're done with the Dawn Court postage stamp embroidery project. I really hope this video was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down in the comments. And again, I will have the downloadable pattern for this available in the comments of this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next video.